In a new op-ed in The Atlantic titled "Bill Barr Must Resign," Ayer writes, quote, "The fundamental problem is that Barr does not believe in the central tenet of our system of government, that no person is above the law. Bill Barr's America is not a place that anyone, including Trump voters, should want to go. It is a banana republic where all are subject to the whims of a dictatorial president and his henchmen." And joining me now is former U.S. Attorney, Deputy Solicitor General, and Deputy Attorney General Donald Ayer. Mr. Ayer, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So I read your letter. I told you during the break that it frightened me, but I'm very glad that you wrote it. Because the thing you presume about an Attorney General of the United States is that they understand that their job is to essentially be the attorney of the people. Mm-hmm. Donald, it has been very clear from the very beginning that Mr. Barr believes he's Donald Trump's personal, sort of the hand of the king. You called what he has tried to do un-American.
Right.
Can you explain why you say that?
Well, I do. I think the one thing that I think we can all agree on, and I think certainly people in this generation since Watergate, when our justice system really was reformed in some pretty significant ways, have taken for granted the idea that you can count on the system of justice and it's going to be fair and it's going to be impartial and it's not going to be politically influenced. And the reality is, and we know this from all the things you've mentioned and some other things he's done, but we also know it from things he has said in great detail. He does not believe that the president should be above the law. I'm sorry, he doesn't believe that the president should have to play by the same rules that everybody else. He believes that the president should be above the law. And he made that the clearest in a memo that he wrote back before he was Attorney General back in June of 2018. When he wrote a memo, it seems some people have said maybe he was trying out to be Attorney General, but he wrote a long memo arguing that the Mueller investigation at that time was totally unsound and shouldn't be going forward. And the centerpiece of his argument was that constitutionally, the president has total control over all processes of the executive branch, and including the processes of the Justice Department and criminal investigations. So any idea that the president had obstructed justice while president is a non-starter, because the president, he said, literally has the complete power to control all criminal investigations, including investigations of himself. So one of the ironies that I've found is that the president's own statements in recent days, when he's talking about, I have the right to interfere, all he is doing is quoting what Bill Barr has told him.
Yeah.
And so I think that fundamental tenet is not consistent with what I think pretty much all Americans believe to be true. And the real problem is he is getting to try, and he's making real progress on carrying it out.
Well, and that's what's scary. So Donald, he was called the cover-up general. William Safire, a conservative columnist, called him that back during the George Herbert Walker Bush years when he was pushing Mr. Bush to pardon people who were implicated in the Iran-Contra affair. So he had these tendencies going all the way back. But what you're describing, and his speech that he gave to the Heritage Foundation, describes someone who essentially is a monarchist. Some lawyer friends of mine have said he is essentially a monarchist. What would be the difference between Donald Trump and essentially the leader of a banana republic if he can prosecute all the president's enemies, if he can undo the investigation into the Russiagate by saying, I will just put people in jail for trying to find out if Russia was helping him, and if he can let Donald Trump's friends off the hook? What's the difference between that and a king?
Well, there may not be very much, but I think the important thing to realize and why he's making so much progress is that he's doing it piecemeal. And so you're seeing a drip, drip, drip. You're seeing an event that occurs, and it seems odd. You know, when he did the whitewashing of the Mueller report, right, a lot of people said, gee, that doesn't seem right. But it was just the one thing, you know, and then we got the report and we looked at it, and a lot of people said, hey, you know, there really is a lot of evidence of obstruction. Gee, that's a shame. And of course, Mueller himself had written a letter about it saying that wasn't quite accurate. And then you wait a while, and then the next thing comes along, and it's a series of things, and they're not all the same. So a lot of the things that his Justice Department has done have been in the nature of Office of Legal Counsel opinions that are justifying stonewalling Capitol Hill, stonewalling traditional requests for witnesses to appear, requests for documents to be provided, and a sort of an ironclad refusal to do it across the board and writing legal opinions to justify it, you know, refusing to turn over the president's tax returns, even though there's a statute saying that the Congress has a right to have them. So a lot of these things, they seem odd. A lot of people aren't paying attention to some of them. They accrue over time, a month later and 2 months later and something else. And if you don't focus on the whole picture, he's not standing out and giving a speech about saying, I want a king.
Yeah.
He's actually just implementing it a step at a time.
Very quickly, he isn't going to resign. I mean, he is wielding more power than any attorney general has ever wielded, so he's helped by it. Donald Trump has the inclination to be a king, and so he wants this kind of AG. Do you believe that there should be, that if massive amounts of people began resigning from the Department of Justice, that might be the one thing that might make a difference here? Because he isn't going to resign.
Well, you know, I don't know. I mean, I think everybody has to do what they feel right is and right in their conscience. And, you know, I'm a citizen and I've watched this for a while. And I've reached the point where I can't stand to watch and say nothing. And I think people have got to stand up and act in good faith to assert what they believe. I believe that he should resign. I believe that if enough people in the country stand up and believe that he should resign, he might resign. It might become politically untenable for the president to have as an attorney general someone who is enabling a system of government, which I think if enough people learn that what they're doing is they're creating a system in which the president can be a dictator. That's really what they're doing. And Bill Barr would never admit to that, but that's what they're doing. He admitted to what he wrote in that memo. I mean, he wrote in that memo that the president is above the law and can control all criminal investigations. And he's argued vociferously for all of these policies that, you know, he doesn't even want the courts to play a significant role.
No one can stop him because in his mind, I do believe that he does want a dictator. He seems to. Donald Ayer, thank you very much for coming forward. Thank you for the piece. I recommend everyone read it. Thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.